Hi, folks. Okay, so this is it. This is where you're going to bring everything together to figure out what the aliens are actually going to look like. Now, I'll qualify this by saying you can't know exactly what they're going to look like, but you can make some pretty educated guesses from this. And so that's the technique that I'm going to teach you. Once you finish your project, once you have found your habitable alien world and you know all of the characteristics on the planet's environment and its star and all of that, the next part is going to ask you to describe the alien, and you're going to determine 9 different characteristics about the alien and its society. We're going to do that based on 7 different parts that we found from the previous data. So let's take all a look at that. Let's start bringing it together. Let's get started. Okay, so remember, the goal is now that we found our aliens, we want to come up with at least a pretty good guess for what they're going to look like. So we do know, based on everything we've talked about to this point, we can be reasonably certain that natural selection applies everywhere, because it's really natural selection is based on logic, not any kind of science or technology or anything like that. So because of natural selection, we do think that they will be the intelligent aliens will be the ones who are best adapted to their environment. So by knowing their environment, we can figure out what adaptations they'll actually have. So we're looking at these environmental and biological parameters. These are the ones that you're going to pull out of your data that you found for the habitable alien world. So you're going to know the star luminosity. You're also going to know how far the planet is from the sun, from its star. So that's going to give you an idea of how much energy that planet is receiving. The mass of the planet, that's going to give you an idea of the gravity, how heavy the planet is. If we've got a gravity that is much higher than Earth, well, then these things are going to have to be built from an engineering standpoint. They're going to have to be shorter and stockier with more legs to support that weight. Whereas with a lower mass planet, they can be taller and thinner. The planet's temperature, that's going to give us an idea of what kind of physical body they have. For example, if the planet's very cold, they're going to need some way to keep themselves warm. So they're probably going to be, hairy, or they're going to have, you might imagine that they've got lots of blubber, body fat, things like that. On the other hand, if it's a cooler environment, or even, if it's a warmer environment, then they may not wear clothes at all. They may have, like elephants with big ears, to try to radiate that heat out from there. The planet's atmospheric pressure, this tells how thick the atmosphere is. This gives you an idea of how geologically active the planet is. The more active the planet is, the more it's going to churn those chemicals and make that energy available for chemical needs. What the planet's atmosphere is made out of, this is going to tell you what kind of metabolism it's going on. Remember, the waste products of metabolism are going to be in the atmosphere. So once you've identified what they are, you're going to be able to figure out what the waste products are, and then you can go look and figure out what kinds of aerobic reaction or methanogenesis or whatever has occurred that's going to produce those waste products. Based on all of the above, then you can figure out its metabolic classification. Do you think it's going to get its energy from the sun? Do you think it's going to get its energy from chemical reactions? Is it going to get its carbon directly from the environment, or is it going to be eating things? And then again, once we know the respiration reaction, you know its energy. If it's high energy, that's going to tell you something about the technology of the world. They're going to be, hunters. They're going to be able to actually chase predators down, so they're going to be more active, as opposed to if they've got a lower energy, they're going to be more sedentary. They're not going to move around a whole lot. They're going to be more gatherers. So let's take a look at some of the different characteristics from this. By the way, all the pictures that you're seeing here are real. These are of actual Earth creatures. So even though they look alien, they're all actually real things. So let's suppose I have a bright star and a planet that is close to the star. So there's lots and lots of sunlight. Do you think that the dominant life form is going to be photo-based or chemo-based? Well, remember, the life form will evolve to take best use of its environment. So it's probably going to be photo-based from that. If I've got lots and lots of sunlight available, if you don't have to go out and hunt your food, if you can just sit there and absorb that sunlight, you're going to be able to take best use of your environment. Now, I don't want to say that there aren't chemo-based life forms on that planet, but we're saying that the dominant life form is going to be photo-based. Now, on the other hand, the opposite is true. If I have a dim star, or if the planet is far away from the star, there's not going to be much sunlight. And so in this case, what do you think, photo or chemo? Well, in that case, it's probably going to be chemo-based. All right, when we look at the planet mass, again, this is an actual critter. If we look at the planet mass, a high mass, like I said, means a high gravity. So that means that the organism is going to evolve to be lower to the ground. Any organisms that were tall had to develop muscles to do that, and any falling would cause great damage to them. And so they probably wouldn't have survived to have lots of babies from that. So the dominant life form is going to be low to the ground. It's probably going to have a lot of legs because it's going to need to support that. I mean, you think about it, if you've only got, even if you've got four legs, you've got this mass in between that's going to try to hang down. That's going to put a lot of strain on the spine. So it might have six legs or more. It's generally going to be stronger if we were to come to Earth because the muscles are going to be developed for working in this higher gravity environment. So if they come to Earth, they're going to be super strong compared to us. It's also not going to be as mobile. It's going to be a lot harder, even though they're stronger on their own planet. I mean, they're stronger on our planet. On their own planet, they're having to fight that gravity. And so there's going to be less inclination for them to move around quite so much. On the other hand, if it's a low mass, then it's basically going to be the opposite for all this. It's going to have a low gravity, so the life forms are probably going to be taller and thinner. And they might have two limbs like we do because we are bilaterally symmetric, but they might also just have one. And we found this actually when we were exploring on the moon. The astronauts were working on an environment that was 1/6 the gravity of Earth. They found if they tried to walk with their two legs, they would trip. And the best way for them to get around was actually to hop. And so if you have a very low gravity world, they probably will just have one limb, one leg, so that they can just sit there and hop around. That's going to be the most efficient way for them to get around. They're also not, if they came to Earth, they're not going to be as strong because their muscles won't have developed in the higher gravity like we have here on Earth. And so they're going to be physically weaker than us. However, on their own planet, they're certainly going to be more mobile because remember, you think about those hops. When you can do, if you're sitting on the moon and you can do a 30-foot jump shot, you can sit there and bounce around anywhere that you need to go. And this thing is just wrong, and yet it's real. So when we're looking at planet temperature, a cold planet, the organisms are going to have to keep their heat inside. They're going to have to conserve that heat. Whereas on a hot planet, they've got to come up with some way to dissipate that heat. So this is why elephant ears are so big, because they're basically radiators from that. Also clothing, when you think about that, you can determine what kind of clothing they're wearing. If they're on a cold planet, even if they've evolved to have blubber or fur or something like that, if they're technologically capable, they can develop a way to insulate themselves, clothes. On the other hand, if it's a really hot planet, that clothes become a disadvantage, and so they're probably going to be naked all the time. The planet atmospheric pressure then, high pressure means it's got a thick atmosphere, and so that means the volcanoes are continually erupting. It's geologically active. The fact that the volcanoes are erupting very quickly means those waste chemicals are being reprocessed back into the oxidant and reductant. And so the chemical energy becomes a lot more possible on that. So one of the things you're going to look at when you look at the atmospheric pressure of your habitable world, if it's really high, that means there's lots of volcanoes. So maybe chemical is a good bet. On the other hand, the opposite is true. If it's got a low atmospheric pressure, it's got a really thin atmosphere, that means the volcanoes are basically dead, just occasionally erupting. And so it's not going to be churning those waste products into reactants again. And so chemical energy becomes a lot less viable. Not impossible, but a lot less viable. When we look at the atmosphere then, like I said at the beginning, this is going to determine what the aliens are going to be able to breathe. Remember, you're seeing waste products in the atmosphere. Now, it is possible for us to also see some of the reactants. So for example, we see oxygen in Earth's atmosphere, even though oxygen is not a waste product for the dominant life form, right? However, there is another large group of life forms called plants that oxygen is their waste product. And so the plants are providing the oxygen that we're getting here. So there might still be another life form that's producing some of these other things. So you've got to decide which of these waste products is due to the respiration from the dominant life form on the planet. Remember that the reaction must be spontaneous, so it has to give a positive energy. Can't give a negative energy unless there is a very strong energy source. So, for example, if you've got a planet that is very close to its star, or if it's orbiting a very bright star, now they've got abundant sunlight. It may be that they're using the energy from the sun, and now you can have something like photosynthesis working. Once you've figured out the respiration and you've figured out, all the different parts, then you can start to classify them. Is it an autotroph? If it's an autotroph, then it's getting its carbon directly from the environment. Well, that's a good choice for something that has a very low energy, right? They don't have to move around much. It also doesn't need to go hunting things. So a heterotroph, on the other hand, is going to be eating things. That means by necessity, it's going to be moving around. So that means it either needs to be camped next to this geological source of carbon, or it's got to be able to have high enough energy from its respiration to go out and hunt things. That respiration energy then is going to tell you what its activity level is by determining how much free energy it's got. So a low energy means it's got to conserve energy. It's not going to be moving around much. It's going to be hanging out in the trees like this. So they're going to be more likely to be farmers, so where the food basically comes to them. High energy, on the other hand, they've got lots of excess energy, so they can go out and gather whatever food they need. And so they're not dependent on waiting for the food to come to them. They can actually go out and get it. So they're going to be more likely to be hunters than they are to be gatherers. So using all these parameters, then we can look at its physiology and its culture. So these are the characteristics that you're going to have to determine for your life form. So you're going to have to determine its body style, its respiration reaction, its activity level, highly active, not so active, locomotion, how it gets around, its metabolic classification, its carbon source, energy source, technology, and that's a lot of its technology. By that we mean, is it a hunter or is it a gatherer? That kind of thing. And then the climate and dress on the planet. So if it's a hot planet, or if you've figured out that the overall temperature of the world is actually quite high, then maybe you've got a desert world and they're going to be naked all the time. Alternatively, if you find that the temperature is actually quite low, then you may find that either they're wearing lots of clothes, or maybe they've got extremely hairy bodies or lots of blubber or something like that. Okay, so when we're talking about body style, we're basically looking at tall and thin, or are they short and squat? So, and most of that you can determine just looking at the gravity of the world. For respiration, which of these respiration reactions is it using? Look at the ones, you're going to look at the two tables, the oxidants and reductants that we've looked at. Those are going to be the most common ones that are available to you. They're not the only ones, but they're going to be certainly the most common, and that's going to simplify it enough to restrict it enough for our purposes. Activity level is going to be based on its energy, its excess energy. So is it going to be fast or is it going to be slow? This guy's just wrong. How do they move around? If they only have one limb, then they're going to be one leg, then they're going to be hopping around. But maybe they've got six, and so they're galloping around, things like that. So how many supporting limbs do they have? When we're talking about a metabolic classification, that's very straightforward. We're talking about photo and chemo, autotrophs and heterotrophs. Carbon source, if you've decided that they are a heterotroph, for example, then they must be hunting their carbon. They must be getting it from somewhere. If you've decided that they are an autotroph, well, then they must be getting their carbon from the environment somehow. And then energy source, again, if you've decided that they're photo, then they must be getting their energy from the sun. On the other hand, if you decided they're chemo, they must either be getting it from their food, or like the creatures down at the black smokers at the bottom of the ocean, they're getting from hydrothermal vents. Again, this guy's just wrong. So by technology, we're basically saying, are they hunters or are they gatherers? With that. Climate and dress, we talked about. Do they wear protective clothing, or are they just naked? So you'll use this information. And when you're doing your project, even though it should copy that information down, it's a good idea to take screenshots of all of the different characteristics. There's going to be 3 pages of characteristics from your planet. Take a screenshot so that you've got those available to refer back to. And from that, you can get all of this information here. So let's take this sample. Let's suppose that you have a star that's putting out 5 solar looms, and it's 1 AU. The planet is 1 AU from the star. The planet mass is 3.5 times the mass of the Earth. You've calculated the surface temperature, not the effective temperature, but the surface temperature to be 400 degrees Kelvin. The atmospheric pressure is quite high. It's 10 atmospheres. And the planet's atmosphere is made of water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And all of this information is given to you in your class notes here. What I want you to do is I want you to pause the video, and I want you to figure out all of the 9 characteristics that are listed on page 2 of your class notes. Body style, respiration, activity, locomotion, metabolic classification, carbon and energy source, technology, climate, and dress. Pause the video, work that out. Have you got it? Okay. So I'm going to give you my guesses at this. There are a number of different ways that you can interpret this. There are some things that are just wrong, but in general, there's a lot of different possibilities. As long as your possibilities all work together to give a consistent picture, you're going to be fine. This is exactly what you're going to be doing in your final project. All right, so for body style, looking at the planet mass, this is much more massive than the Earth. So I decided that they're going to be short and squat because it's so massive that they're going to have a very high gravity that they're going to have to be working against. All right, when you look at the respiration, then I decided it was going to be photosynthesis. We've got a really bright star. So there's lots of energy, and we're actually fairly close to it. Remember, this is 5 times brighter than our own sun, yet it's at the same distance. So we've got a lot of energy. Also, when you look at the reaction here, the waste products from photosynthesis are going to be water and oxygen, are going to be oxygen and sugar. Well, the sugar I'm not going to see, but I certainly do see oxygen in the atmosphere. So that's a distinct possibility. The waste products then from aerobic respiration are going to be carbon dioxide and water. Well, the water, I might see some water vapor, but there's other sources of water, remember. Carbon dioxide could also be produced by volcanoes, for example, so it might not necessarily come from it. You can make an argument for aerobic respiration, though. All right, because it's using photosynthesis, remember that requires energy, so they are not going to have a whole lot of free energy, so I'm going to assume that they've got a very slow movement. Since it's a high gravity and they've got a slow movement, I'm going to assume they've got a whole lot of legs. So at least 4, but probably more like 6 or even 8. For the metabolic classification, they're getting their energy from the sun. That's going to be necessary for photosynthesis. And the planet is certainly geologically active because it's got 10 atmospheres. So I'm going to guess that they are a photoautotroph. The reason I chose autotroph is because they're not able to move around much. Because they've got a slow movement, that means that they're not going to be able to just go out and hunt a whole lot. So I'm going to assume that they're getting their energy source from the sun and their carbon source is very nearby. So since they're an autotroph, they must be getting by definition, they're getting their carbon from the environment. So that makes them kind of like a plant in that sense. Again, their energy source, because I decided they were photoautotrophs, then I have to choose sunlight for this. So once you've decided on the metabolic classification, that's going to set these two for you. You're not going to have any freedom with that, really. All right, when I think about the technology, they're slow moving, they're getting their energy from the sun, and they're getting their carbon from the environment. So I'm going to say that they're probably gatherers. They're not going to have a lot of free energy to be hunters. And then climate and dress. This is a very warm planet, 400 degrees Kelvin. That's considerably warmer than the Earth, which is about 288 or so. So it's going to be very hot. So I'm going to assume that it's going to be a very warm climate, and so therefore they're just going to be naked. They're not going to wear any clothes at all. So this then would be filling in these blanks, and they're from drop-down boxes, so you'll have choices that you'll pull from to answer these. And then I found a science fiction picture that kind of matches what's here, so this is not real, but this is kind of what I picture this particular life form looking like. Okay, keep in mind, we don't really know what they look like. And, the odds of them looking exactly like this are pretty small when it comes down to it. But at least it fits, and it gives me kind of an overall impression of what they might be like. So we do, however, understand natural selection and biomechanics, the fact that you've got to be lower to the ground to fight against the gravity and things like that. And really, for the most part, you're having fun with this. You've got data and you can actually support what you've got. Is it going to be real? Well, okay, not necessarily, but at least we'll give you a ballpark estimate. Like on this planet, we can say for sure that they are probably not tall and spindly from that because the gravity's too high. But we can come up with a pretty reasonable approximation based on that. If the life form is detected, then this is actually the kind of analysis we're going to have to make. So if we ever do find a habitable world and we see biosignatures there, we're going to go through this exact same analysis that you're doing to try to come up with an educated guess for what those aliens look like. Now, how will they react to us? Well, maybe we can actually tell based on some of the things, like if they're hunters, are they going to tend to be aggressive? Are they going to be somebody who is programmed to think about going out and getting things that they want. This might inform how we might approach them to try to establish peaceful relationships. Okay, so we're going to give you another chance at this with the practice. I'm going to give you the same information that you would be getting from your final project, and then I want you to come up with the justification for each one, make the decision and justify your answers based on each one of these. You're mostly being graded on your justification. Obviously, if you've got some answers that are inconsistent, then you could lose points for that. But for the most part, I'm looking for your justification. So if your justification makes sense and you've chosen well based on your justification, you're going to be just fine. Okay, so now you've achieved your task. You figured out how to find an alien world, how to find out if it's habitable, and you've also figured out how to determine what those aliens are probably going to look like and what their technology is going to be. So, for the rest of the semester, the last week of the semester, though, we need to, now that we found them, how do we talk to them? So, we're going to look at how we might communicate with aliens and how we've done that before. And then also, if there were aliens there, how long does a civilization last? How long will our civilization last? Those are the last two pieces from the Drake equation that we'll need to study to be able to figure out exactly how many of these aliens you've just found exist in the galaxy. We'll see you next week.